the place of the human body, place of the human being, human body, one way or another becomes central in any of the esoteric systems, and certainly when it comes to shared religious beliefs. It would have been fitting to bring direct examples, and I thought about it, so I'm going to do it now. For instance, we all know in Christianity the routine use of self-mutilation to drive the desire, the carnal desire of the body. Remember? From wearing the things that are painful, just as a reminder that the body is a place of sin, right? To the self-flagellation, right? And of course, theological attempts were made to link all that to identifying with the suffering of Christ, all that stigmata, right? But this is not going to fly, really. It's a very poor attempt at justifying something which arguably can be seen either, and this will be a more innocent perspective, as a complete delusion and misunderstanding of the real message and the teaching of Christ in this case. Or worse still, is a conscious attempt at creating the possibility where, not the possibility, creating a possibility, creating a condition where a follower, a so-called Christian, faithful Christian, lives under a heavy burden of some sorts. So in other words, there is already this suppression. There is this heavy psychic weight to carry. And carrying the cross, and the story of Christ repeatedly has been the story of all from nativity, or going beyond from the Annunciation to the nativity, to flight to Egypt, to return the teaching and the first ministry, the years of ministry, and all the way to the what happened afterwards. You know what happened. There's no need to go over this, but superimposing that onto the life of a faithful Christian, that there has to be this conscious suffering, this suffering which one takes upon oneself as the very path towards salvation. It could be simply summarized as a cruel interpretation of spiritual teaching of Christ. Cruel because cruelty here is imposed on something which is innocent. Body is always innocent. This is a key understanding. Sacredness and innocence of the body. It's a very important understanding as well, because of these centuries of this religious imposition in terms of the psychic guilt that the body carries already because of the fall, and then body needs to therefore be treated as such, as a place where it's constantly there is a possibility of falling, a possibility of being claimed by the lower aspects of the body. And this is where the biggest, perhaps, the most severe damage is done. I would even suggest, without insisting, simply suggesting as a conversation, that some of the worst forms of perversion, so prevalent, by the way, in our culture, are the result, the outcome of that what was suppressed. That suppression goes somewhere and begin to rear its ugly head when it can no longer remain in that suppressed state. Whereas the attitude towards the body as the place of celebration, because that's what it is, the place of celebration is the place, and why celebration? Because that's what innocence is. It's a very different, radically different perspective. We should not confuse this with that how this was justified, that because of the way the body is, it is swelled with desires. And many of these desires, if not, well, certainly desires that are associated with instinctual behavior for preservation of the species, so it's procreation, instinctual desire for, again, preservation of the species, so it's the desire for preserving the body at any expense. This cannot be used as a justification, because there are plenty of other philosophical and religious doctrines which found its way around, where the body, even at its lowest forms of self-expression, is considered to be integral when we view the body in terms of all what it represents. So we will look at it now from this point of view. And by the way, the analogy that was given is not only extended to the Western culture. We can see these echoes, whether this was due to the influences that coming from and during the time of the cross-pollination of all the ideas, primarily via the Silk Route. But there are many systems in yoga with mutilation of the body. All these yogic so-called disciplines to keep body under tight control, particularly for those who have been given to the vow of chastity, are horrifying. We're not talking about yogis who, demonstrate their powers, right? But sleeping on the bed made of, right, barbed wire or nails. And there are many other pockets and extremes of what to do. I don't know if you have seen them. Tying male genitalia with the huge, heavy blocks of rocks, so that this is the answer how to conquer the downward movement of apana, so as not to get any erectile excitement. Have you seen these pictures? No? It's horrifying, but quite fascinating. Huge blocks on chains, these are the so-called solutions to suppress that. We're going back now to Friedrich Nietzsche. This is the Apollonian attempts at restoring the order at any cost. Because at a certain point down under, the body begins to present very, very unpredictable manner of all sorts of things, what it can come up with. And of course, the most feared aspect here, and I'd like to make this kind of like an attempt at really fusing it in. We'll bring it together. But the most feared of all is, of course, our sexuality. The sexuality is the most feared aspect. But it's not alone here, you see? Sexuality is just as much feared as the high expression of consciousness, that what we call love. Sexuality is feared at the low expression because of the tremendous power that it represents. It is the power over which we have no control, no matter how much we like to pretend. We may feel a certain degree of being on top of it at a certain point in time, but we have no control over that. Therefore, it always posed that dilemma. Then it comes what can be spoken of as more refined expression of that very same force that is experienced at the level of erotic expression of that power. And now we can bring this to the level of the heart. And it is just as much feared, because the power of love has these very same qualities. It claims utterly and entirely and reduces us to what we don't like to be reduced into when the true love is experienced. And furthermore, what could be spoken of as the highest expression of that power is the power of pure transcendence, equally feared, equally considered to be, on one hand, the most formidable force. On the other, should always and somehow be reserved only for few, because this is walking out of the matrix. This is walking out of the domain of any structure, because that's what transcendence really represents, let's face it. Transcendence, you are no longer anybody's. Transcendence is no longer belonging to any structure. It's what could be spoken of in terms of self-administering power. That self-administering power of one's own consciousness was always feared, had to be kept under control. So you have these three forces of the expression of the same power at the lowest strata of, as it were, of its domain, as that erotic power, the power of sexuality. At its level of expression as the feeling, that love, and as pure transcendence in terms of standing alone, entering into one's own sovereignty. You cannot be a sovereign of someone when you enter your own sovereignty. So you cannot be all the, what is it? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't, right? Was not able to put Humpty Dumpty back into place, basically. So this is what it boils down to, effectively speaking. And yet, from Tantric perspective, from Tantric point of view and understanding, and this understanding is rooted in the understanding of the spiritual anatomy, of the esoteric anatomy, of the internal side of things. All these are interconnected. All these main manifestations of the same power, intimately interconnected. To begin with, This is proverbial, it is known everywhere, certainly known now, much more widely available, much more spoken about, that the sexual power in itself is the creative power. It's the creative power, the universal power of creativity. So the potency here and might is always in direct relation and proportion to one's ability for creating, one's ability for creativity, readiness. It's not about screwing around, being horny all the time. Let's not confuse this, because the true experience of one's sexuality is inseparable from involvement of the totality of one's structure, totality of one's energetic currents, which incorporates and includes the fullness of the being. We're not talking about erogenous zones and readiness and what have you. We're speaking about the being aroused at every respective level. That's what a state of creativity here represents. And in the biological terms, this is expressed with the ability. This is the ability to procreate, equals here and could be spoken in synonymous terms with the ability to create. So procreation and creation here are not separate acts, somehow one lower than the other, but they're one, we would say, the expression of the polarities of the same energy. This is the greatest reservoir of all energy. And again, if we are to look into it from the perspective of the internal alchemy of the process, without the quality of that energy at all its levels, because that's what here ojas, as that final byproduct of digestion, represents. Because what ojas here represents, it's a Sanskrit term for the final tissue, reproductive tissue. It's the substance that is produced after successive digestion at every respective level of the tissue, of the dhatus. From the moment something is ingested, ate, and metabolized, it goes through the process of re-refinement, whilst at the very same time feeding every respective level of body's structure, whilst also re-refining that what is being digested and passed on. So as the byproduct is immunological substance of consciousness returned back into its pure form. So the might here, the physiological might to procreate, is expressed through the healthy amount of that procreative power as ojas, which is required for both creative processes and for all the love games if one wants to be engaged in. There's an insufficient amount of ojas or quality of it will render us impotent one way or another, or everything we do will be one-sided. There is always a possibility of dissatisfaction entering into our life. And not to mention the healthy functioning sense of individual boundaries here, which are sacred. We're not talking about selfishness, lack of altruism, lack of compassion, lack of empathy. We're talking about healthy psychological boundaries. What are they? They are the expression of how plumb we feel in our own skin, as it were, which protrudes outward as that energetic field. When we feel good, we are not at all feel in any way invaded. You see? Why? Because the insulating layer of that ojas here is always an invitation. Don't just take it wrongly here. Don't just jump to conclusions. It's an invitation. It's a pulsating signaling of ready to procreate all the time. You know, you are like, let's say, at the level of the animals, you have great peacock feathers, or you dance like this bird in a fantastic way, you know. You're ready, you signal this out, you send it out. But at the human level, of course, it means much more. It means that you're ready to create, you're ready to connect in every way. Lovemaking is not only happening when we are united at the physical level. One can make love in myriad of ways, at a distance. I'm not talking about fantasies, I'm talking about connecting with someone at the level of ideas is a form of lovemaking in my vocabulary. You can make love by transcending the limitations of space and time. So these qualities of that at once, what serves here as a minological substance, as that ojas, which is required for luster, for optimal, healthy functioning of your immune system, and readiness to be given to a creative act.